Welcome, everyone. I hope you're here to see the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group presentation of Cleopatra's Needle, the journey through Bloomingdale and the Upper West Side. This should be a fabulous presentation. My name is Jim Mackin. I'm here to assist two of my fellow Bloomingdale Neighborhood Group members, Michael Gonzalez and Gil Tauber. Um, uh, the first thing I'll ask you to focus on, you'll see on the bottom left part of that first slide, upperwestsidehistory.org. If you go to that, you'll see all the wonderful work we do about local history, including an announcement of our next presentation on February 20th about Jauncey's Lane. If you think you know local history, this will be a very pleasant surprise. That presentation will be done by Suzanne Ray with some assistance from me. So if you go to the Bloomingdale Branch Library on 100th Street, you'll see some fabulous panels of history done by another member of our group, Rob Garber, and we change them every 3 months or so. The one that's there now is called Broadway in Bloomingdale, and there's some fabulous images there and some text history that should be pretty thrilling. And of course, if you read the West Side Rag, you've probably seen a few of the blog articles by another fellow member, Pam Tice. All of Pam's blogs are on our upperwestsidehistory.org site. So we have a lot to cover tonight. So let me introduce our featured speaker. I'll assist him, but Gil Tauber. Gil, you ready to take it away?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, nearly everyone watching this has seen Cleopatra's Needle, the ancient Egyptian obelisk that stands in Central Park behind the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In addition to being a famous New York landmark, getting it from Egypt to Central Park was one of the great engineering feats of the 19th century. Cleopatra's Needle also has a special connection to the Bloomingdale neighborhood, which we'll get to later. Now, the first thing you ought to know about Cleopatra's Needle is that it has nothing to do with Cleopatra. It's one of twin obelisks, each 69 feet tall, that were erected near Cairo by Pharaoh Thutmose III in 1443 BC. That was about 1,400 years before Cleopatra herself was born. Now, obelisks, usually erected in pairs, were an important monumental shape for the ancient Egyptians. They were associated with the Egyptian sun god, and the pyramidal tip was often clad in gold or another polished metal to reflect the sun's rays. Later conquerors of Egypt admired and coveted obelisks. About 10 or 12 BC, after Egypt had become part of the Roman Empire, Augustus Caesar had Thutmose's twin obelisks floated down the Nile from the original site to Alexandria and erected in front of a temple dedicated to Julius Caesar. The ancient Romans brought more than a dozen other obelisks to Rome itself, including the one now in St. Peter's Square. Fast forward now to 1301, and let's see if this works. Yeah, here we are. Fast forward to 1301, by which time Egypt was ruled by the Muslim Mamluk dynasty. In that year, 1301, an earthquake in Alexandria toppled one of Thutmose's twin obelisks, but fortunately it did not break. It was about this time that the two obelisks started to be called Cleopatra's Needles. In the picture, the obelisk still standing is the one now in Central Park. The fallen obelisk in the foreground is the one now in London. For most of the Middle Ages and the early modern period, Europeans had little direct knowledge of Egypt. That changed with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. In addition to 40,000 troops, Napoleon's invading force included a contingent of over 160 scientists and scholars, collectively known as the savants. They studied, recorded, and frequently looted Egyptian art and cultural artifacts. After 3 years of bloody warfare, the invading French army was soundly defeated by a combination of British and Ottoman forces. Despite Napoleon's defeat, the work of his savants spurred a huge interest in ancient Egypt in the early 19th century, especially after the deciphering of the Rosetta Stone in 1822. The enthusiasm for ancient Egyptian culture extended to the United States, where in 1838, New York City erected a massive city prison in the Egyptian style of architecture. That building and its successors have ever since been known as the Tombs. Now, back in 1801, the Egyptian government, in appreciation of Britain's help in ridding it of Napoleon, made Britain a gift of the fallen Cleopatra's Needle, the one that had been lying on its side for 500 years. But it was another 76 years before the British actually took possession of their obelisk. After a hazardous sea journey, Britain's Cleopatra's Needle was erected on London's Thames Embankment in 1878. That's where you see it in the picture. That's in London. The first suggestion of sending the other Cleopatra's Needle to New York was made in 1869 at the opening of the Suez Canal. This was in a conversation between Ismail Pasha, the Khedive or Viceroy of Egypt, and William H. Hurlburt, editor of the New York World. The idea was that the gift would stimulate American interest in trade with Egypt and perhaps counterbalance British and French influence in Egypt's politics and economy. There was no immediate action, but Hurlburt continued to champion the proposal. In 1857, the news that England was bringing its obelisk to London spurred his campaign. He enlisted the financial support of railroad tycoon William H. Vanderbilt and Parks Commissioner Henry Stebbins. And he also recruited John Dixon, the British engineer, who had just transported Britain's obelisk to London. Now, when Dixon sought Ismail Pasha's permission to take the remaining obelisk to New York, he found that the Khedive was having second thoughts about his promised gift. The removal of the British obelisk had awakened nationalist sentiment in Egypt, and Ismail Pasha was under pressure to protect its cultural treasures. Frustrated, Dixon withdrew from the project. But at Hurlburt's urging, Stebbins petitioned Secretary of State William M. Evarts to intervene. With diplomatic pressure, Ismail Pasha finally consented, and he put it in writing in a letter dated May 18, 1879. A month later, the Khedive abdicated in favor of his son, Tawfiq Pasha. Only the written agreement prevented the new regime from rescinding the gift. Our story now turns to an American naval officer with the deliciously named Henry Honeychurch Garringe. Garringe was born in Barbados, the son of an English clergyman. At 14, much against his father's wishes, Garringe went to sea as a cabin boy on a British merchant ship. That voyage ended in a shipwreck on the coast of India, but there a British missionary came to the boy's aid and arranged his passage to the United States. Garringe's next few years are unclear, but at 21, he joined the U.S. Navy. He served with distinction in the Civil War and rose to the rank of lieutenant commander. In 1876, he was assigned to conduct a 2-year hydrographic survey to update the Navy's charts of the Mediterranean coasts and islands. For this expedition, he was given command of the Gettysburg, an old paddle-wheeled steamer that had been captured from the Confederacy in the Civil War. In 1878, toward the end of the 2-year Mediterranean survey, the Gettysburg had to put into Alexandria for repairs. According to his second command, Lieutenant Seton Schroeder, it was then that Garringe first laid eyes on the promised obelisk, and that he probably began to consider how he would go about transporting it to New York. Its survey mission completed, the Gettysburg returned to America. Shortly thereafter, William Hurlburt, the newspaper editor, advertised for proposals to move the obelisk from Alexandria to New York. Garringe entered the competition, and his turned out to be the only satisfactory proposal. A letter from Vanderbilt notified him that he was awarded the $75,000 contract. The catch was that the $75,000, about $2.4 million in today's money, would be paid only on completion of the project and only if it were accomplished within a year. Undaunted, Garringe accepted the terms, obtained a leave of absence from the Navy for himself and Lieutenant Schroeder, and found a patron to lend him the money needed to finance the work. So Vanderbilt drove a hard bargain, and Jim has some more information about Vanderbilt. Jim?
Yeah. And let's show them. I think we have an image of the obelisk in Alexandria. Followed. Nope.
This one?
No, go forward after Garringe. That one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there it is in Egypt. Wonderful, real photograph. And now we can go to the next image of William Vanderbilt.
Let's see. There he is. Yeah.
And just to put him in context, he's frequently associated with the New York Central Railroad. He's the son of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. And Cornelius Vanderbilt, at a previous presentation we had done a few years back in the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group, pointed out that Cornelius Vanderbilt sent his son, Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr., not this son, but the other son, and his wife to the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum for short periods. But anyhow, we're back to our story here. William H. Vanderbilt is absolutely necessary to make all of this happen because he funded the whole thing. And that enabled Garringe to go ahead and do all that he had to do. So Gil, please continue.
Okay, where are we? This is slide 9. All right. Okay, so there's Cleopatra's Needle in Egypt. Right, here we are. In planning the project, Garringe had studied the methods used in the earlier movement of giant obelisks from Egypt to Europe. However, all of those were essentially coasting voyages. None required transporting such a huge object across the waters of the Atlantic. While still in New York, Garringe had worked out the methods needed for each phase of the operation: to lift the obelisk from its base, to rotate it to a horizontal position, to lower it to the ground, to move it to a shipyard, to load it into a vessel, and to protect his unwieldy but fragile cargo in the event of rough seas. He designed arrays of steel cables, a huge pivoting clamp, and an iron framework, all of which could be disassembled and reused to reverse the process once the obelisk got to New York. He contracted with John A. Roebling's Sons, the company building the Brooklyn Bridge, to fabricate the cables and metal parts. He hired a master iron foreman, Frank Price, to supervise the metalwork and bring the finished parts to Alexandria. And he also hired a master wood foreman, Henry Davis, to procure the lumber and supervise the wood construction needed to protect and move the obelisk. These arrangements having been made, Garringe and Schroeder sailed first to England to search for a suitable ship, but were unable to find one. Pressed for time, they continued to Alexandria, and there they found the iron-hulled steamer Dessous. It had once carried mail for the Egyptian post office, but had been decommissioned and partly dismantled. But they bought the hulk from the Egyptian Postal Service and set about making it seaworthy. Garringe and Schroeder arrived in Alexandria on October 16, 1879. Within 3 days, a force of 100 Arab laborers began work. They dug out the ground around the pedestal and foundation, erected scaffolding, and sheathed the obelisk in wooden planks to protect the hieroglyphics on its surfaces. Now, there had long been opposition to the rule of the existing Khedive of Egypt, particularly among the influential foreign merchant colonies, mainly French, Italian, and Greek. and I should say these are people who have often lived in Alexandria for generations, but retained their original nationalities. But they dominated Alexandria's commerce and city government, and the removal of the remaining Alexandria obelisk was seized on as a political issue. Although the Khedive had been persuaded to make good on his promised gift, the work was repeatedly delayed by bureaucratic roadblocks, spurious lawsuits, and even threats of violence. At one point, the worksite was guarded by a cordon of sailors dispatched by a friendly Russian admiral who happened to be in port. The hoisting machinery arrived from New York in mid-November, and by December 2nd was in position. An arrangement of steel cables was placed around the bottom edge of the obelisk, and using multiple blocks and tackles, the shaft was lifted free of its pedestal. A steel framework held the trunnion, the pivoting mechanism, similar to that used on a cannon or a telescope. And this was used to turn the obelisk from the vertical to the horizontal, where its upper half came to rest on a tower of stacked timbers. A second tower was then built under its lower half. And here you see the obelisk after turning and before the second tower is built up under its other lower half. At this point, the obelisk was 43 feet above the bottom of the pit. Hydraulic jacks atop the timber towers gradually lowered the obelisk to ground level. With the weight resting on the jacks, a layer of timber was removed and the obelisk was lowered several inches to rest on the next set of timbers. The jacks were then repositioned and the process repeated. This painstaking operation took 3 weeks. While the turning and lowering went on, work proceeded on building the huge box or caisson in which the obelisk would be floated to Alexandria's port. Garnish's original plan had been to roll the obelisk through the streets of Alexandria on cannonballs, but permission to do this was denied by hostile municipal officials. The alternative was to enclose the obelisk in a caisson, basically a big box, build a launching ramp out into the water, and tow the caisson to Alexandria's dry dock. And this turned out to be the most difficult phase of the entire project. In Roman times, the obelisk had stood well inland, but over the centuries and after successive earthquakes, the ground to seaward had subsided. The waters offshore were now littered by ruins of submerged palaces and temples. Before the launching ramp could even be built, divers had to demolish and remove thousands of tons of ancient walls and columns. This process, repeatedly interrupted by bad weather, took more than 4 months. Garnish used cranes to load the obelisk's pedestal into the Dessous, but no ordinary ship had a hatch large enough to load the obelisk itself into its hold. Once the dry dock was available, the Dessous was hauled into position. The dry dock was pumped out, and workmen removed steel plates on the starboard side to create an opening large enough to accommodate the obelisk. The waiting obelisk was supported by cannonballs resting on iron tracks. The tracks were extended into the ship. The obelisk was then rolled into place, and the opening in the bow was closed up again. Garnish had a hard time finding a crew for the ship. Early on, he'd hired from England 48 men, most of whom either deserted or turned out to be drunkards. A replacement crew was hired through an agent in Trieste. By the time the ship was ready to sail, 3 of those had also deserted. Of those that remained, only 4 could speak or understand English. At this point, the Dessous was personally owned by Garnish. Under American law, according to Garnish's account, it couldn't be registered in the United States. Registering it in Egypt would be legally hazardous. Registering it either in English or a French ship would not be politically acceptable. Garnish therefore decided to sail with no registry at all, going without the legal protection of any nation. This posed the risk that the ship could be seized in any port. However, the only port he planned to stop at was Gibraltar to take on coal. So to avoid going into the harbor there, he arranged to have the coal transferred by lighters at sea, just east of Gibraltar. The Dessougue departed from Alexandria on June 12, 1880. The loading of coal off Gibraltar was without incident. There were some mishaps on the way: a leaking boiler, a broken crankshaft, which forced them to proceed under sail for several days, a fierce storm. Nevertheless, the Dessougue arrived at the quarantine station off Staten Island on July 20th, 1880, was cleared to proceed, and moved that afternoon to a mooring on the Hudson off 23rd Street. There, the Dessougue was thrown open to visitors, while the park commissioners resolved a last-minute dispute over its eventual location. So I'll now turn the floor and the screen over to Jim to tell you what happened after the obelisk reached New York.
Well, we wanted to talk through a fair amount of detail as to even getting it to New York, because the rest of it will be about how it comes through our neighborhood. But I'll emphasize 2 points even off our notes here. One is, and Gil will, or maybe our notes might reveal this a little bit later, the obelisk spent more time coming from West 96th Street in the Hudson River to its final place than it did crossing the Atlantic Ocean. That's one point. A second point is simply that you're probably getting a sense that there's a lot of engineering on the go. Most all of the stuff that's being done by Gorringe and the crew and whatnot had never been done before, or was so specific to this situation. They were incredibly concerned about not destroying the obelisk. And if it had fallen anywhere, there was just a good chance of that. It was red granite, and red granite can be brittle under certain circumstances and whatnot. But anyhow, William H. Vanderbilt, who we mentioned, he's the fellow who's financing all of this. His preference was that the obelisk be in Central Park. Before Gorringe had even sent out from Egypt in 1879, the specific site in the park, known as Greywalk Knoll, was selected by a committee consisting of the editor, W.H. Hulbert, we mentioned him before, the landscape painter, Frederick Church, great Hudson River artist, and Gorringe himself. However, when Gorringe arrived with the obelisk in July of 1880, the site had still not been officially approved by the commissioners of Central Park. Now, just a quick word on that name, Greywalk Arch. Greywalk refers to a specific kind of sandstone that is kind of prominent in the Hudson River Valley. If you ever walk under one of the many arches in Central Park, one of the great works of Calvert Vaux, it's called Greywalk Arch right there. There's typically a fellow playing saxophone, so I think most people know what I'm talking about. But anyhow, Andrew Haswell Green, who was much involved in everything in the city, and especially Central Park, objected to the chosen site, and he championed a location at 59th Street and 5th Avenue. Could you imagine if the obelisk was there? The West End Association, which had a lot to do with building up our Upper West Side, they championed putting it in what would become Columbus Circle on 59th Street, close to the 8th Avenue. But after much politicking, Green was outvoted and Greywalk Knoll was approved. So let's move to the next slide showing moving the pedestal. The pedestal is interesting. If you walk up to the obelisk today, you'll see it sits on a pedestal that's larger than any pedestal you've probably seen in your lifetime and will never see again. That the first step in all of this process in New York City was to unload the 50-ton pedestal by derrick from the ship's hold to a wharf at the foot of 51st Street on the East River. There it would be suspended in chains by a horse-drawn truck, the only one in the city capable of carrying it. It would then be hauled through 51st Street to 5th Avenue, then up 5th Avenue to the park entrance at 82nd Street, and from there moved to its final position on greased skids. It was, Gorringe wrote, the largest and heaviest stone moved on wheels for which there's any record, and the largest ever moved through New York City, except for the obelisk itself. So we're hearing some incredible accolades with all this. But according to Gorge, there were tidal currents made a landing at East River Shore undesirable. So they deferred to the North River, then called the North River, today the Hudson River, abreast the park at one break, and that is 96th Street. If you know the Hudson River on the west side, you'll know that 96th Street used to be the site of Stryker's Bay. The next harbor, if we could even call it that, is probably up around Dyckman Street. At the foot of 96th Street, West 96th Street, therefore the obelisk itself would be landed. Gorge planned to land the obelisk by reversing the procedures that he used in Alexandria, that is, using a dry dock in caisson and then floating the obelisk to 96th Street. However, it turned out to be only one suitable dry dock in New York Harbor, and the owners, knowing this, demanded an exorbitant price. The alternative was to use a marine railway, such as the one used to launch ships or to haul them ashore for repair. But this posed a problem in getting the obelisk afloat once it had been pulled out of the Dassault's hold. Gorge then hit on a method of using the rising tide to lift the obelisk and the falling tide to land it, meaning he would position it in such a way simply by using the tides. Again, engineering on the go, the likes of which probably had never been done before. Before revealing his plans, Gorge visited incognito all the marine railways around New York Bay. He chose a recently built marine one on Staten Island to avoid more price gouging. He contracted for its use without disclosing the unusual cargo. So we have an image coming up that shows it being unloaded in Staten Island. The Dassault's bow was hauled out of the water on August 21st of 1880. Opening the bow took another week. Remember, they had taken out plates in Alexandria just to enable it to fit into the ship. The obelisk was then hauled out using a pile driver engine. Meanwhile, huge pontoons were constructed, placed between the piles and filled with water to prevent them from rising prematurely. At the appointed time, the obelisk resting on the piles, the pontoons were pumped out, and the rising tide was allowed to lift the obelisk. A steamer belonging to the city's dock department towed the obelisk to 96th Street, where a landing stage had been prepared similar to the one on Staten Island. The trip took a little over 2 hours from Staten Island up to West 96th Street. At 96th Street, the pontoons were inserted between the lines of pilings. The pontoons were then allowed to fill with water, and as the tide fell on September 15, the obelisk was left supported by the pilings.
Before we leave this image over here, notice under the tip, just under the tip of the obelisk here, the cannonballs.
Yeah.
That were, see the cannonballs running in these grooves, in these channels that were used for moving it at this point. But he had to change that.
Yeah, so, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. This daunting photo, which Gil and I love, and so does our mutual friend Gary Dennis, shows the New York Central Railroad coming down the West Side Highway. This is all covered today by Riverside Park, obviously. But imagine the logistics of moving the obelisk across the tracks and having to stop rail traffic. So according to the next obstacle was crossing that busy railroad track that ran along the Hudson River. Fortunately, the head of the railroad was none other than William H. Vanderbilt. The New York Central had just purchased that railroad shore line. The longest interval between trains was about an hour and a half in the middle of a day. Of course, the railroad tracks and railbed had to be carefully protected from damage with the weight of the obelisk. This required creation of a temporary timber bridge. Each timber was charted and marked so the entire array could be swiftly assembled as soon as the trains were halted and quickly taken away when the obelisk was safely across. This preparatory work, just to get it ready to cross the tracks, and tracks are only typically 4 feet, 10 and a half inches, took 10 days. Train traffic was halted at 11 a.m. on September 26th. You could see some of the crowd of people that are there. The temporary bridge was immediately erected across the track. The obelisk mounted on an 80-foot long cradle, and it was hauled across, losing the engine of a pile driver moored into the adjacent wharf. Within an hour and 20 minutes, the obelisk was resting on the bed of 96th Street, and the railroad tracks were entirely clear to allow freight traffic and train traffic to continue. So here we show some images of the side and some of the engineering involved. Listeners, I explained a little bit of this. In Alexandria, the obelisk had been moved across land using cannonballs rolling in channel irons. You can kind of see that on the left part of this diagram. However, it was found that under the weight of the obelisk, the cannonballs tended to split the channel irons into two angled irons, requiring frequent repair. So at the landing of 96th Street, Gorringe adopted the way beam and roller design used on the Marine Railway, and that's what you see on the right there. To keep in alignment, each roller had a flange around it in the middle, much fitted to a groove in the way beam. Again, engineering on the go. Our next slide shows it. Shows the obelisk moving up 96th Street. And at the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group, we had a movie with Roy Schreider. I forget the name of the movie, but it showed a car chase down 96th Street, and you really got a sense of the height there. And of course, if you stand on 96th and Broadway and you look down to the river, you're looking beyond the way old Stryker's Bay and whatnot, but you'll see the elevation change. Once over the tracks, the street rose 60 feet in just the 1,200 feet from the railroad to Broadway. The steep grade it had to handle the heavy load. The way beams could not be laid directly on uneven street surface. Instead, transverse timbers were laid across the street and carefully adjusted before the way beams were placed. To hold the obelisk uphill, a 6-inch thick rope, you can imagine a 6-inch thick rope, ran from a block anchored in the street bed to the drum of an engine mounted on the obelisk cradle. As the obelisk inched forward, men followed closely behind the rollers with wedges, just in case, to stop any backward movement and the fear that the obelisk would just start to fall back down on 96th Street towards the Hudson River. After the obelisk passed each set of ways and rollers, they were picked up and moved ahead of the obelisk. They just kept moving the whole operation forward. While workmen were still moving the obelisk up the hill at 96th Street, the foundation was being prepared in Central Park. The granite top of Graywack Knoll was leveled off and its cracks filled with cement. The stones in the foundation were reassembled exactly as they had been in Alexandria, and the pieces bound together by iron and steel clamps, similar to those used by the Romans. Lead boxes intended as time capsules had been prepared to fill in the available spaces enclosed by the steps. Various government departments and private organizations contributed items, including a proof set of US coins in 1880, copy of the Declaration of Independence, Masonic emblems, a hydraulic jack, copies of the Bible, Webster's Dictionary, complete set of works of Shakespeare. We didn't research enough of this, but presumably under the steps leading up to the obelisk, there's a few of these time capsules. So here we have the image laying of the cornerstone. On October 9th, a parade of 9,000 Freemasons marched up Fifth Avenue to a solemn cornerstone laying ceremony. Now, this is just the cornerstone. The Masons were a large and influential group organization in 19th century America. Vanderbilt, Hulbert, Gorringe, and Schroeder were all Masons, as was the mayor, the police commissioner, several other officials. The obelisk was also very significant to the Masons since Masonic law, their brotherhood, traces its history to the engineers and stonemasons in ancient Egypt. It took nearly a month from September 30th to October 27th for the obelisk to travel that 1,200 feet from what is now Riverside Drive just up to Broadway. At Broadway, a hydraulic jack was used to raise the rear end of the obelisk so that it could be turned to head south on Broadway. And as you know, 96th and Broadway is pretty busy today, and it's a major stop on the IRT subway. That turning operation alone took 6 days and nights. So I think we have an image, Gil, of the turn.
No, this is a little later. This is
A little later at 86th Street. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. We apologize for the seemingly unfocused images. We're just happy with whatever we have.
Yeah.
We've pulled from
Yeah, here we are. Yeah.
sources. One of the main sources is what the Metropolitan Museum put out, a wonderful booklet. And I think they put it out twice, but it's probably the best book about the detailed history. The next leg of the journey was at 86th Street. It took 8 days to turn east on 86th Street using new turning apparatus. It took a little over 24 hours. And from there, the obelisk was hauled eastward to Central Park through the 86th Street Traverse and south on Fifth Avenue to what was then an entrance at 82nd Street. Now, this is before the large Met was built. The only part of the Met that was built was the oldest part, which you see if you go into the European Master Galleries on the first floor.
You see the wall from I think it's called a Petrie Court. You see this brick wall.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's all there was. And of course, our friend Andrew Haswell Green was the person who even decided that the Metropolitan Museum of Art could be in Central Park. And he also is the person who decided that the American Museum of Natural History would not be in the park. Instead, it would be in what is still, I think, officially Manhattan Square. But anyhow, the final stage of the journey. So let's look at the trestle. This trestle is going to take the obelisk from Fifth Avenue to Greywacke Knoll, where it would be erected, and that's where it is today. It was designed to fit the obelisk to a height of 48 feet. So that's pretty high up, where it could be clamped into the same trunnion that had been used in Alexandria to turn it from vertical to horizontal. Again, they are so concerned about this thing accidentally breaking Roebling's wire ropes or falling somehow or gaining momentum so that it hits the ground and cracks. They bent over backwards to do everything they possibly could to keep this intact. On January 5th, the obelisk was positioned with its center of gravity over the pedestal. From its arrival at 96th Street in the Hudson River, it traveled 10,905 feet in 112 days. As I indicated earlier, this is nearly 3 times as long as its voyage from Alexandria to New York. So here we see a photograph where they're getting ready to write it up. The obelisk would be turned and placed on its pedestal in a formal ceremony announced for noon on January 22nd, 1881, which is today. So today we celebrate. I wish we could take credit by planning it this way. Gil, maybe you planned it this way, but it sure worked out nicely.
I didn't plan it this way, no.
But 144 years ago, all sorts of dignitaries, from the mayor to Haswell Green to Senator Evarts to Gorringe to all these people that were of consequence in bringing the obelisk to New York, they were all there for that formal ceremony on January 22nd, 1881. They estimated there were about 10,000 spectators in the city. The city hadn't yet, the center of the city then was probably still maybe around Herald Square. I don't think it reached Times Square yet. Not many people in the northern part of Manhattan, but 10,000 people came up here to watch this. Grandstand built for dignitaries. Secretary of State was there, Secretary of the Navy was there, Marine Band played, battalion of sailors and Marines formed an honor guard. And here we have an image, the next image of Cleopatra's Needle around 1889. You could see the majesty of it. You could see the original building from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the background. Today, that's much larger with all the additions that made. So long before the Romans moved the obelisk to Alexandria, about 12 BC, vandals and souvenir hunters had chipped away at the bottom corners. On resurrecting the obelisk in Alexandria, the Roman engineers provided each of the four corners with bronze supports in the shape of giant crabs. Next time you're close to it, you'll see those crabs. But I'm going to move us right ahead. And each crab, by the way, weighs 922 pounds, if you can imagine that. But I'm going to jump right ahead. The next image is going to acknowledge a Bloomingdale resident of note. Gil, yep. Dan Gutman. Dan's tuning in and watching us. Dan is a prolific author of children's literature, and we are so pleased and honored that his book here does all of what we're trying to do, which is celebrate Cleopatra's Needle. This is going to be a wonderful book to read to your children if you could take them through all of the detail we've done and are putting on Zoom. But thank you very much, Dan. We're honored to have you here. And we're simply going to end by showing you Gorringe's grave up in Rockland County. And appropriately so, his gravesite is an obelisk. Gorringe resigned from the Navy in 1883. He became a partner in a shipbuilding company in Philadelphia. He died in an accident in 1885 when he fell trying to get off a moving train. He's buried in Rockland County, Rockland Cemetery, actually, near Nyack. If you're up in that area, you could seek that out. I'm going to leave you with just one quick piece of trivia because oftentimes people will say, what's the oldest man-made object in Central Park? And I'm going to let all of my fellow experts, Pam Tice, Gil Tauber, Rob Garber, any other Bloomingdale neighborhood members want to chime in. I think in descending order, the three oldest things in Central Park are the blockhouse on the northern end of the park, which dates from about 1814. And then before that, we have the Randall bolts and monuments, which are embedded in the park when Colonel John Randall surveyed the city for the grid in 1811. And only one Randall bolt is publicly known at the intersection of approximately 65th Street and 6th Avenue. Everyone can see that if you walk there. And the oldest man-made object in Central Park, I think, I'm subject to any correction, is Cleopatra's Needle. So we're honored to have Cleopatra's Needle. We thank you for listening to this wonderful detailed presentation. Special thanks to my partner in crime here, Gil Tauber, who collected all these wonderful notes, and to Michael Gonzalez in our group. And Michael will be taking questions from the chat and any other questions that maybe we can attend to. So Michael, you ready?
Yep, I'm ready whenever you guys are. So anyone who has a question can either raise their hand and we'll let you unmute yourselves, or you can place it into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll just go through them. Here, I'm gonna stop your video. Gil, give me 1 second.
Oh, should I stop my screen share?
Yeah, that'd be
there
great.
we are. Okay.
All right. So Helen, I'm gonna let you unmute yourself here.
I'm embarrassed to ask this question. What holds the obelisk vertical? Just the weight of it? Why doesn't it fall over?
Well,
Bill?
well, those crabs that we referred to Those they're a half ton each. They're like wedges at the bottom corner, at each of the bottom corners of the obelisk. And in addition, from Gorringe's description, they also had some kind of metal dowels, which also helped to steady it. I can't. I don't know anything beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, something, I mean, every time I look at it, I think, how come it's still just standing like it's standing and hasn't fallen over yet? Right, thank you.
That's right.
For this, we need an engineer.
Yes.
No, it is very impressive that it has stayed in its condition all these years. Any other questions? Feel free to, again, to put them into the chat or raise your hand and we'll let you unmute yourselves.
I'll just mention in passing, again, if you go up to the obelisk, you'll see some signage there, some brass signage, so permanent signage that talks about the hieroglyphics that read on the sides of the needle. Nothing that would interest most of us, but it kind of goes back to when Gil covered that early period in the early 1800s. After Napoleon and British explorers and people got into Egypt, the whole world seemed to get on an Egyptian kick. And one of the keys to helping that along was the Rosetta Stone, when they had to figure out what the Rosetta Stone enabled them to decipher hieroglyphics, because there was a language no one was familiar with. So much has been written about that. And you could see the Rosetta Stone. I think it's still in the British Museum.
I think so, yeah.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah.
All right, Julia, feel free to ask a question now.
Hi, so was Gorringe paid and did he make a profit?
Well, he ran quite a bit over budget. And but in the end, Vanderbilt did cover the additional costs. And in Gorringe's own book, he describes, let me see, the final cost of moving the obelisk was nearly $28,000 over Vanderbilt's original budget. In the end, he agreed to cover the extra costs, but Gorringe's net profit on the contract was only $1,156. I mean, which wasn't chicken feed, of course, in 1881, but still not that spectacular. But he had gained a national reputation. He did a lot of lecturing, and he published this very influential book called Egyptian Obelisks, which is one of the principal sources for this presentation. And then, as Jim mentioned, he became a partner in this shipbuilding firm. And so, his career might have gone a lot further if he hadn't died in that unfortunate accident just 2 years later.
All right, thank you. Okay, any other questions? Feel free to ask him as well.
I think we might have a question or a comment in the chat room. Michael.
Yes. Yeah, Dan Goodman over here. Just wanted to let people know if anyone wanted a copy of the book, they can email him here at his, it's in the chat as well. So it's dangut444@gmail.com.
It would be. I'm going to just ramble a little bit. It would be interesting amongst us Bloomingdale neighborhood historians, what would be the most significant events in our entire in the history of our neighborhood. And, you know, I would think this might be in the top 10. Um, so- Something else might be like the building of the IRT in 1904, or the Croton Aqueduct coming through. Um, I
Yeah,
could
right.
probably make a short list of stuff, even laying out some of the key streets, Riverside Drive. It's funny, I always thought a simple measure of how important and interesting any topic is the number of books written about it. So I thought long and hard about this. In our neighborhood, I don't think any book's been written about Central Park West per se. I don't think anything's been written about Columbus Avenue per se, or Amsterdam Avenue per se, or West End Avenue per se, although the landmarks designation reports give wonderful detail, seemingly building by building on West End Avenue. But
Well,
numerous
there was
books,
a novel. There was a novel
the Herman Wall.
titled West End Avenue.
Yeah, yeah. And then Broadway, a number of books have been written about Broadway because it's it extends from Battery Park all the way up to Yonkers. And at the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group, we recently had Fran Leeden, 2 or 3 years back, his wonderful new book on Broadway. And one of my favorite books is David Dunlap's book on Broadway from about 2000 or 1999, which is really wonderful because it goes almost building by building. But there's about 2, maybe 3 books on Riverside Drive, and the new definitive book on Riverside Drive, and it's a joy to read, is our own Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group fellow, Stephanie Azzarone. Heaven on the Hudson is a history of Riverside Drive and Riverside Park, if you're at all interested in that. So she's helped make Riverside Drive important. On Cleopatra's Needle, of course, we have Dan Gutman's book. We have the Metropolitan Museum of Art bulletins. I think there's 1 or 2 other books. And Gil, you alluded to Gorringe's memoirs. That's going to be hard.
Well, after the book that I mentioned called, he has a book called Egyptian Obelisks,
Okay.
which discusses obelisks besides the one that he moved. But it's mainly about, his experiences, and a lot of what we've got in, what we've talked about today comes from Gorringe, and a lot of what was in the Museum of Modern Art bulletin and the succeeding freestanding version of that
I tell you,
also is based on Gorringe.
Gotcha. That just reminded me, my wife and I took one of those all too common trips down the Nile. And at one of the stops, they show you an obelisk in the ground, not yet extricated from the ground. So more chipping type work has to be done. But you certainly get a sense of the size of it, the monumentality of it. And the other thing you get a sense of, because they tell you, is just how they do that work. It's a lot of hard labor, but they also employ a lot of wet wedges, because when water freezes or heats up, it moves. And so you can use that to crack along certain lines. So that meant they had to have some knowledge of I'm not using a technical term here, but the crack lines in granite and stuff. It's fascinating to think. And of course, some of these same principles would be used when they crafted our very Central Park in Riverside Park.
Yeah.
We have a question here actually from Charles, who's out from Long Island. I wanted to know if the obelisk, the one in Central Park, was made from one slab of granite, or if you guys know.
Oh, yes. It was made from a solid block of stone.
Got it. Yeah, no. It's always impressive seeing just in the middle of the park outside of the
Yeah. I'm going to ramble again, Gil, and anyone, if you know something different. In the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in our neighborhood, some of the columns there are one piece of granite.
Yes.
And they're from that. Are they from that quarry up by Peekskill, or are they from
they're from a quarry that was on in Maine, and it's on an island.
Mount Desert Island? No,
I don't think it's Mount Desert Island.
Okay,
But I
interesting.
remember taking a tour of the cathedral
Yeah.
and that being pointed out to us.
Yeah. Who is the fellow that did a presentation for us on New York City rocks and topology?
Oh, I don't, he's no longer with us.
Sid Horenstein, who passed away.
Horenstein, yes, yes.
Sid was so good with this stuff that he could
Oh, it
look
was
on the
marvelous,
side
yeah.
of a building and tell you where the rock came from.
Yeah,
You
tell
know,
you what quarry it came from. Yeah.
where it came from. Now, sometimes on our touring, and I'll mention we have our monthly neighborhood tour this Sunday at 2:00, leaving as we always do from Strauss Park. And sometimes we love to point out at the base of buildings, they use the very local Manhattan schist as part of foundation work. I don't think it's a structural stone, but after I guess they put down cement and whatnot, they can use it to maybe surface some of the foundation stuff, which is the same stuff you see on the wall at Central Park, for example. So,
Yeah. Mhm.
Nope. Last question we have is, do you guys know how does the obelisk bear against the New York City weather, like the snowstorms, rain?
Well, it has suffered a good deal, suffered more from pollution, actually. And over the years, it suffers from pollution, and then it had suffered, from what I've read, it suffered from some ill-advised attempts at restoration or preservation. So the hieroglyphics on the obelisk today are much faded from what they were in 1881. Although that's probably true of any large stone structure that has stood out through the decades of industrialization and burning of fossil fuels, so forth.
Gail, do you think it's ever been struck by lightning?
Gee, I don't know. That's a possibility.
Yeah, yeah.
I was the other day. I was looking at the some pictures, from certain events, recent events in Washington, D.C. And it struck me that, the Washington Monument which is an obelisk, was designed in the 1850s.
That's right.
So it's design architect that swept over the United States.
Yeah.
In the first part of the 19th century.
And took many years to complete because of funding issues. But I'll tell you, if anybody ever passes through Baltimore, Maryland, I think that's the first official Washington monument in obelisk form. It's certainly not as big as the 555-foot Washington Monument, but it's impressive nonetheless. So on that note, I think we're going to...
What year is that from?
Earlier, 1820s or 30s. I don't know the exact year.
Oh,
yeah. It's in that square that's surrounded by the museum and what's the music school there? I forget. Is it the Peabody?
Peabody?
I think so. I'm forgetting the name now. I haven't been to Baltimore for 3 years. So. But I think we should wrap it up with this, and we want to thank everyone for your attention. As Michael pointed out, this will be on Zoom tomorrow, so if you brag about it to your friends and you want to give them the opportunity to see it, it'll be on Zoom tomorrow. And certainly if you have any other questions, just send them to our website at upperwestsidehistory.org. If you go to that website, you'll see all the wonderful things we've got there. We've got a listing of almost 1,100 buildings in our neighborhood as to architect and the date they were designed, constructed. So thank you again, everyone, so much for watching and listening. The Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group, our presentation of Cleopatra's Needle, the journey through Bloomingdale and the Upper West Side. Thanks.